Okay, so hello. We are moving into a topic which I'm not the most comfortable with, given that economic analysis has not been what I've been doing for a very long time, and I don't feel fully comfortable reading a text, some of the texts. Of Roderick, depending on which one. There's less technical economics in some and more in the others. But with all that said, the topic itself is perhaps the most important one for the course, because the question of why now populism, and why what are the possible versions, given that causality, what are some alternatives to even populism? All this becomes much more clear once we go through some excellent analysis like that of Roderick, and there are undoubtedly others too, but I rely on him mostly, using Colin Crouch as a kind of political theoretical sociological complement to Roderick's analysis. If you remember, last time I presented a causal model of why populism and why today, which distinguished between political, cultural, and economic deficits, and I focused on the political. And this, I think, was right, because the phenomenon is first and foremost political, and because the relationship to economics has been the most variable to the history and to culture as well. The political definition we give here applies fairly well to all populisms from classical 1930s, 1940s Latin American versions quite well, whereas the economic context, as undoubtedly you realize, is very, very different. And I would say the cultural context too, to the extent, for example, that in lots of countries it is the challenge of immigration that has brought to focus deep cultural conflict. So there was a real point in defining the phenomenon primarily politically. But as I told you already, when speaking about the middle term, in the middle term, causality can only be fully successful if we take into account the economic and cultural dimensions or deficits as well. All the more so because it will depend on cultural and economic challenges, or the mix of these two types, what type of host ideology the populism will rely on. So we have to bring economics back in, and we can, given, as I said already, the very excellent studies of Denny Roderick. Interestingly, the text I rely on mostly is from 2017, Populism and the Economics of Globalization. What Udipta has distributed now is another essay, Why Does Globalization Fuel Populism? The two are compatible, but there is a time difference between them. And interestingly enough, I think in that time, Roderick, I will say something about this, has become more skeptical about the possibility of left populism, which he doesn't reject. In fact, he supports, but he thinks that in the 2020 essay, it is the right wing that is the biggest challenge today. That's interesting, right? Because uh, just 10 years ago, we would have said, focusing on Latin America, that the left-wing version is alive and well and represents a very important political challenge to probably all of us. Roderick was of that view in his earlier essays on this topic, but there seems to be a shift. I will not focus on that shift first, though, but mention the elements of his analysis which I think are rare in all the settings, in both settings, with slight changes between them. So, as you can tell, trade liberalization is present in both of the essays, and so is capital liberalization in both of the essays. Though I think, interestingly, the focus on trade is greater in the second essay. Focus on capital is more important in the first essay, but still they are both present and play a significant role. Well, let me go through the steps then, and in between them include another dimension, the problem of compensation, which is interestingly neglected in the second essay, and I think that tells you something about the relative weakness of social democracy today, and of course economic populism too, which piggybacks very often on social democracy as its host ideology. So trade liberalization, the argument in the first essay begins quite technically. I must say I don't fully understand it, of why every single expansion of trade simultaneously produces winners and losers. As I'm thinking about this, what I think is the clue is the relationship of exports to imports, because every act of trade liberalization opens the door to some import, which inevitably produces competition for the local producer, and makes the local producer worse off than he or she was previously. On the other side, though, you can say that the trade liberalization, this is the classical argument for trade from Ricardo on, is the kind of seed or kind of tide that lifts all boats. And yes, from trade liberalization, all of us benefit to the extent that our prices, for example, would be lowered with cheaper imports coming in. So there are winners, exporters, losers, importers, and there's a collective gain too. And this I cannot test because I really have to just simply rely on what Roderick says. The overall gain, the macro gain for everybody is relatively small. Whereas the gain for exporters is significant, and the loss for importers, those whose previous product has been replaced by imports, is significant. So there is some, I'm not the best person to really explain this to you if you have doubts, but at least so far, I think it should be clear, right? That we talk about the China shock, both essays talk about the China shock repeatedly, and all of us realize that with liberalization of U.S. trade with China, just to take the two-country example, we all get cheaper products. That's a gain for everybody, right? The cell phone you're using possibly has been made these days probably in Vietnam and not in China, but the point is the same for an earlier moment. So we all gained through lower prices. But the person who was producing the thing at home previously and now is outbid by the lower price is a loser. Whereas given trade agreements, somebody is going to export to China in return because the Chinese also removed barriers, and that person is going to be a gainer. And this, of course, means in general, gainers among capitalists as well as workers, losers among capitalists as well as workers. But there's a significant difference because the mobility of capital is greater than that of labor. And so the capitalist investor can shift his or her investment, whereas the worker who is tied to a particular occupation and a particular locality, it does not move as easily. So so there will be greater losers also on class basis. And this is connected then to the resulting inequality. It's not that an equal number of workers gain and equal number of workers lose, but rather that the gains and losses are also distributed along class lines. Roderick, in both essays, tells us that we should not think of trade as the greater, or trade liberalization as the greatest pressure on labor, because the post-industrialization of economies, automation, rationalization of production, all are costly to labor. But the globalization, especially in its current stage, phenomena add to that. And as Roderick nicely puts it, in the case of trade, we know who is the competitor, whereas in the case of industrial innovation, technological change, we don't. We admire universally those who innovate on that level, but we are in a competitive relationship with the Chinese producers who invade our markets. And you can see the demagogy reflects this important difference. Now, in the early essay, Roderick talks about compensation, a topic very near my heart because it revives the discussions of the 1970s about the coming crisis of the welfare state. Well, obviously, the welfare state represents the most important form of compensation. And in a very nice empirical claim, Roderick suggests that those countries can afford to be the freest in terms of trade, which offer the largest compensation, which I didn't even know that Denmark, Sweden, Norway, have the freest economies in terms of international trade. And Roderick says they can afford it because they have elaborate welfare state structures which compensate the losers. As you can see, there are always in this relationship losers who are in precarious position. The unemployed would be the most significant sector, of course, that represents losers in the context of trade deals. But you'll see in just a second that along with capital liberalization, there are other kinds of losers too. And some of them are the employed. But compensation makes the losses bearable. Now, Roderick here has not worked with the literature which I have worked with in relationship to this topic. And so you can easily see that his explanation for why compensation is difficult is not very developed. It's only a few lines. It's costly, he says, which of course means taxation. And also compensation has political problems because because state policy benefits some people through compensation and not others. Remember the whole demagogue in the United States about welfare cheaters, welfare queens. This had to do with targeting those who were the beneficiaries of welfare state measures. And of course, just as the trade problem is asymmetrical with respect to winners and losers, so is compensation. Except some of us, like me, consider that to be just because it's losers who are compensated. And so in that sense, it's an act of equalization and not not making people less equal. Okay. Now compensation has become weaker since the 1970s, much more dramatically. The coming crisis of welfare state became a real crisis. Everywhere these budgets have been cut, and in that sense, the system which cushioned the freeing of trade uh, uh, has been significantly weakened in all the countries. Interestingly, because with the demise of the Bretton Woods system, uh, uh, trade has become freer. So even as we have really more need for compensation, we have partially dismantled and weakened the institutions of compensation. Now, in the first essay of Roderick, and this I think is interestingly different in a second, but I don't fully know the reason for it. The first essay of Roderick, the most significant contribution of globalization to our topic here, namely the backlash, which is what he and especially Crouch in some places call it, is capital liberalization. Capital liberalization, of course, is connected to trade because as trade affects the sectors of the economy, capital can migrate to those sectors, indeed to other countries where it would become more profitable. Now, the Bretton Woods system allowed significant capital controls. With the coming of the WTO system, especially in the 80s and radicalized in the 90s, the 90s, I think, are the important dates, the mid 90s, countries agreed to remove constraints on the free movement of capital. This means their own indigenous capital, but also it means that invested capital from the outside can repatriate its profits without any limits. And this has significant effects on our topic, inequality, precarity, insecurity, because, first of all, the movements of capital are irrational, and there can be, even without any significant reason, like the shifting of the balance of trade, capital can move in panics, leave countries, create crises which leave a lot of people in extremely precarious situation. But even more importantly than this rather irrational and unpredictable trend, there is also the kind of competition among countries for capital, which produces very negative results, and in fact, long-term negative results for populations. This is usually described under the heading of races to the bottom. And there's a significant race to the bottom, at least in three areas. In his original book, Globalization Paradox, Roderick mentions a couple of other ones, but three are mentioned in these essays. One of them is the area of taxation. I'm not sure now whether I think it is in an essay. Crouch recalls the Obama-McCain campaign, where McCain openly says, that our corporate taxes are too high because Ireland has 11% and we have over 30. He was not quite correct about either number, but the point is that corporate taxes are much higher in the United States, and of course this means that the corporations will leave. With the free movement of capital, which was not there before, they are able to leave and invest somewhere else. And so the response to this is inevitably a race to the bottom in the area of taxation. You can already see how the topics here are interconnected because the race to the bottom in taxation produces a weakening of compensations. What is the welfare state financed from? It's financed from taxation. If you are forced to reduce your taxes because of tax competition, then of course there will be pressures to cut budgets in relationship to welfare state compensations. The COVID period is very different, right? Because it represents already now over a year when some other logic has been working. But we don't have to discuss that just now. Perhaps in a discussion we could bring it up. The second race to the bottom is in the area of regulations. Everybody talks about this. It's certainly important, but it is just a way of reinforcing the logic of opening, which is connected to trade, and the logic of reducing some aspects of compensation. More important is the domain of labor, which means specifically that competition among countries is for capital is particularly prejudiced against labor rights. If you look at some of the countries, and China would be the most important one, labor rights are much weaker than they are in the countries of the classical European welfare state, and to some extent even the United States. This, of course, creates an incentive, again, for the movement of capital from the country with higher level of unionization to a lower level, with stronger collective bargaining rights, regulation of collective bargaining. Its collective regulation is linked to this, to countries with weaker. And the net result is something that you see everywhere, namely the decline of unionization, level of unionization in the countries where it has been most developed. So to sum up, then this part of my analysis, again, I'm not the strongest person to teach you this, but you should not follow my bad example and not take too many economics courses. You should take courses which actually deal with these problems, whether it is a question of internationalization of capital or trade or labor economics. And I think the new school, at least, you can find all these subjects covered. Still, to sum up this part of the discussion, which is already proposed in Roderick's book, the processes taken together lead not from a world which is not yet globalized at all to one that is globalized, but from one modality of globalization to another. One goes under the name of the Bretton Woods agreements. Keynes was the most important participant of Bretton Woods, and certainly he proposed and helped to achieve a system which left a significant amount of autonomy for the states for their internal regulation, even as they removed barriers and liberalized trade to some extent. The second epoch does not have such a nice name. WTO would be one way, World Trade Organization, globalization would be one possible way, except that the WTO is an older institution than hyperglobalization. But in any case, hyperglobalization is the term that is used by Roderick. And structurally, it means a dramatic removal of trade barriers and barriers to the movement of capital and labor. But politically, but in terms of its details, it has those elements which I described so far. On the European level, the distinction would be between what has been called social Europe. I'm an avid reader of a blog called Social Europe, but that is a project, the blog, and Roderick and Crouch and Piketty and all these folk are participants in that blog. I guess even some new school professors occasionally. Social Europe now is a project. And the term that has replaced it, although it is not quite as used stylistically, is neoliberal Europe. It is the misfortune, I say this to the Hungarian and Polish colleagues who are participating in this class, it's a misfortune that our regime changes occurred in the context not of social Europe. That was true for Spain, Portugal, and Greece still. Greece, I mean, then in the 70s, our regime changes, which involved, of course, a transition also to market economy, took place in a neoliberal context in which, on a European regional level, trade was even more radically liberalized and capital movements were even more freed than they were on the international level. So Europe is a regional structure whose point, of course, always was to counteract the negative. One of its points was to counteract one of the negative tendencies of the international global economy. But internally, it's a small world already, right? And it has created in a way, a more hospitable terrain for the neoliberal pressure and the neoliberal transformation than the world, even the WTO world as a whole. The poor East Europeans, Hungary, my country, Poland, they are represented here by students in the class, are countries which are in a way subjected to both of these regimes. And as you can see from a book like Bela Grešković's very, very excellent book on the political economy of the transformations, it's called Political Economy of Protest and Patience. As you can see from that text, in the actual adoption of the programs of economic transition, WTO, World Bank, and the European Commission were constant participants, setting up in Europe, this was called conditionalities, which had to be met by these countries in order to enter the Union. They were, by the way, met. They are still, in a way, a set which Turkey would have to deal with if Turkey were to join. They were more rigorous, I would say, but this would be something for an economic historian to test, than the conditionalities imposed in some Latin American countries during the period of the neoliberal shocks. Interesting, some of the same people participated in both of these processes, since, as it turns out, it was Western economists and Western experts who played Western European experts in the East European case who played the most important role. So much on the context. Now, the question then is, how is this to be linked? To populism and the choice between left and right populism? So I should say right away that what was hopefully the strength of my previous presentation is indeed the weakness of Roderick's, because he's, of course, outlines very good reasons why there will be a backlash and resistance based on hardship and insecurity and inequality. But why populists will actually be the beneficiaries of it is not clearly said. We need, in this context, to make clear that populism is the answer, because there is also an underlying deficit on the political level, which has to do with representation. And that in part is independent of the phenomena we just mentioned. For example, the the halting of political democratization in almost all countries where it was a very important phenomenon until the extension of suffrage, uh, uh, full extension of suffrage, and in some countries, in France, for example, the decentralization of political power in a country that was highly centralized before. All this belongs to the past, but the halting of democratization is not the only phenomenon. The growth of the executive in all countries, and as Crouch stresses in his post-democracy thesis, the increasing power of corporate lobbies and corporate interests in democratic politics, which historically wasn't new, but it fluctuates. And in the period of the welfare states, it is clear that the welfare states were achieved in the face of opposition exactly from those quarters. But with the weakening in the welfare state and with the shift of ideologies from Keynesianism to neoliberalism, these interests have become stronger. And of course, it's hard to say whether globalization is a cause or an effect of that. Clearly, hyperglobalization becomes possible because the corporate interests who want to free their capital want it. But on the other side, hyperglobalization frees them and makes them much more powerful, also with respect to the national governments. In this kind of context, one can say that the democratic politics is, it's not replaced by an anti-democratic or non-democratic politics. Post-democracy means the weakening of the normatively democratic dimension of political democracies that formally remain the same in most cases. Post-democracy, in that sense, is formally democratic, but substantively is increasingly oligarchic and never not had an oligarchic dimension just because of even in the electoral systems, but it has increased its oligarchic dimension. And this is a kind of mutually determining process with globalization. But once it reaches a certain point, the critical representation and the critique of the non-democratic dimension of democracy becomes plausible. In this sense, populism, especially in its movement form, represents a critique, a democratic critique of democratic deficits. And it is this that then creates substantive issues around which those who are critics of existing versions of democracy can mobilize. Now, the substantive issues can be much more important to the majorities of populations than the formal issues of representation. In this sense, it's very hard even to say whether populism has host ideologies or whether the host ideologies use populist rhetoric to make themselves more powerful and influential. But in any case, this aspect adds the missing dimension from my previous analysis of how populism becomes powerful in our time. Given the long-term democracy deficit, it reaches a higher level of salience and a potential crisis under the impact of the economic dimension. But if it's the economic dimension, why right-wing populism? In the first essay, which I don't know if you got a chance to read, I don't think so, because somehow we ripped aside the other one, which is fine. It's just as good, but it's a little bit different on this subject. Roderick suggests that economic populism becomes relevant where it is the trade issues and the globalization issues economic issues are the salient ones, and the culture and the right-wing populism becomes right-wing populism becomes more relevant where it is cultural issues that come to the fore under the impact of immigration. Now, immigration is also not independent of globalization. It is connected to the movement of peoples. And in Europe, for example, it was supposed to be free. And as it turns out, in the case of British populism, initially it wasn't so much people from the East or Muslims or Africans who were focused on. Remember the story of the Polish plumber. It was Poles and Hungarians and Slovaks who were focused on because they were the ones who could move into the United Kingdom the most freely. And that is, of course, part of the globalization framework. But here, globalization becomes cultural because the objection, although it could be in part, you're taking our jobs away, was first and foremost the most advanced on the cultural level. You're too different. You not only look too different than we, but you have different habits. Your gender relations are different. That was an important issue in Holland, for example. Your religion is incompatible with our institutions and our cultures. These issues all were articulated, and you have seen them articulated also in the United States. Criminality was another issue. Again, the empirical basis of these arguments are weak, but the rhetorical force was strong. This, I think, Roderick explains in the second essay, where he talks about the supply and demand side of the populist phenomenon. Many authors now in the literature use these terms. He uses them well. And remember, Adam, this is the issue that we discussed previously about when a crisis potential becomes a crisis in a full sense. It depends not only on the demand side. So far, we talked only about the demand side, but the supply side. The demand side is grievances, injuries, social problems that can emerge in the economy and in culture too. But the supply side means that there are narratives, leaders, forms of rhetoric that are available and that can be produced to turn the demand side really salient or to lead to mobilization on the part of those who have the grievances and the demands. And here in the second essay, Roderick suggests that on the supply side, the right populism is much stronger. Interestingly, for an economist, that's a highly ideal discourse-oriented argument. And I will actually want to add some objective economic considerations, or at least objective political considerations, to complement him. This time I go at him from the other side. Previously, I tried to reduce the economistic aspect of his conception by so stressing representation. But certainly on a purely descriptive level, he seems to be right. Now, if you compare, let us say, Orban's rhetoric with any social democratic rhetoric in Hungary today, I mean, I know this man, and he, already when he was in his 20s, he was kind of brilliant rhetorician, as his famous Imre Nagy speech from 1989 indicates. His rhetoric has always been better and stronger. And I would say, although I cannot speak for Kaczynski the same way since I don't know him, nor do I know the Polish language, the rhetoric on the Polish right is also very powerful. I think Walesa indicated that already early on, was the first appearance of the populist phenomenon on the rhetorical level. He didn't win, he didn't succeed, but certainly solidarity as a movement was transformed under the impact of that kind of rhetoric, which was less nationalist or less anti-minority than it was anti-communist. But as such, it was also of tremendous rhetorical power. Remember the bargain between the Reds and the Pinks. Poles will remember that. The Great Round Table is often described that way by people who were there themselves, like Kaczynski. But nevertheless, they never stopped. Orban, too, was a member, an important figure in the Hungarian Round Table. That has not stopped them from attacking that kind of mere elite bargain among the old elite and some new ones who are very questionable, possibly even in terms of their social background. Well, in any case, this was an important feature of the victory of the right, but does not explain why left populism, or if you want, a populism using social democracy as its host ideology, has not been an equal alternative. And Roderick's two pieces indicate that, because even what he taught in 2017 and some earlier essays in Social Europe, earlier very short essays, that left populism is the answer to right populism, is no longer really said in his essay that you read for this class. And I think for this, we need to make this argument, we need to add another feature to our analysis. I think it is demonstrable that there has been a shift of the discourse from the redistributionist axis, the axis of distribution, to the axis of culture. This is a two-axis model that is used by Roberts and Wayland, but also I think Roderick uses it and uses it right. There has been a shift, and the rhetorical strategy, which I mentioned, represents exactly that shift. But why the shift? The most interesting piece I had a chance to read on this subject was, and maybe Udipta can find it for you, by Magnus Marsdal. It's called Loud Values, Muffled Interests. Loud values and muffled interests. It's the same point, right? The value axis is loud. The interest axis is muffled. But who muffled it? That's the interesting question. And just because the populists carry on their loud discourse on the value axis does not mean that the other axis has become unimportant. Marsdal shows empirically that if you question people in terms of their where they put in, this is in Denmark now and Sweden and Norway, where they put their emphasis of their interests, the interest axis remains equally or even more important. They care more about economics than they care about values. They care about values. They tend to have relatively conservative value schemes, the majority of the population. The males worse than the females. The old ethnic group worse than the new ones. You see this in the United States. No, in the United States, yes, in the United States too. There's a gender gap, and there's certainly an ethnic and racial gap on these matters. But still, even for the dominant group and gender, the interest axis remains important. So how was it possible to displace the axes? And Marsdal speaks about the third road or the third way strategy of the left, which other people sometimes talk under the heading of bait and switch. But I think we have to be careful in distinguishing these two these two strategies. The third road strategy means that for reasons that go back to the 1970s, the crisis of the welfare state literature, but which are also in part caused by the challenge of globalization, what uh, uh, Tom Friedman called the golden straitjacket, and is adopted also by Crouch and others for this discussion. The golden straitjacket means that the Social Democrats were no longer free to advocate social democratic policies, expansion of compensation, expansion of, of social welfare. This is the crisis of not just the welfare state, but of social democracy. And this is where bait and switch comes in, because at some moments they still used an appeal to social interests as electoral strategies. But in power, they abandoned what they previously claimed. And this is, in fact, as I can already anticipate, going to be true also for right-wing populism, or some populisms that start out as economic populisms that become primarily cultural in their orientation, as Alberto Fujimori has shown so well, campaigned around a combination of cultural exclusion and economic deprivation. And it became the cultural part that became the more important for him once he was in power. Bait and switch applies best to that kind of actual switch. And it's kind of unfair to apply to the Social Democrats, who even in their campaigns have abandoned an appeal to redistribution. And this is the meaning of the third road, or the third way of Bill Clinton's New Democracy as well, that even in their campaigns, they began to present themselves as more rational managers of hyperglobalization. Usually a Rawlsian dimension comes in, that they will take care of the worst off. That part is going to distinguish them from the outright neoliberals who think that helping the worst off is worse for even the worst off, and certainly worse for everybody else. Well, this phenomenon, of course, not just weakens social democracy, but if I'm right, and I think it's hard to deny this, that social democracy is the host ideology for left populism, it weakens that potential host ideology too, and therefore weakens left populism thereby. Now, I think it makes sense to nevertheless not eliminate left populism as an alternative just because of that fact. And I think that the experience of many Latin American countries indicates, and even Mexico today, that left populism still maintains significant appeal. And the question then becomes, should we consider left populism to be the alternative, even in a moment when it has become, in the international sense, weaker? Here, I think that our two authors, Denny Roderick and Colin Crouch, represent really two diverging concepts. Do they really diverge deep down? That would be an interesting thing to explore. But just on the face of it, Roderick, in several essays on social Europe, has advocated left populism. And he didn't take that back, even at a moment when he no longer thinks that the left populist alternative is as strong as it was before. He doesn't admit outright that in any case. So where does his argument for left populism come from? And in order to deal with that, I think his most influential concept should be introduced. It is not in either of the essays we assigned. It's in his book, The Globalization Paradox, and it is in his essay on Brexit, too. He has a short essay where he expresses ambivalence toward Brexit, kind of supporting it, but not fully daring to say that he does. It's interesting. It's interesting on that level. But here he reproduces the globalization trilemma. Remember, well, those of you who were my students many years back would remember, none of you are, Klaus Hoffe's idea of the triple transition. In the poor East European countries, you have to carry out three transitions, Klaus brilliantly argued. The transition to a liberal democracy, well, that's not very controversial. The transition to a market economy, only slightly controversial at the time. It had opponents, but relatively weak ones. And the transition to a more efficient and more capable state, which amazingly, not with the incredible expansion of the communist state in size, still needed to be created after the transition. This triple transition was never going to succeed, Klaus said. My friend Bill Greshkovich's essay is directed against those prophets of doom who predicted that those three transitions will never work. Elster, Przeworski, and others were others who were among those who predicted the inevitable failure of the triple transition. Well, Greshkovich shows that at least for a time it succeeded, and the difficulties are going to come only now. This he writes in 1998 or 9, and of course the difficulties were to come. Populism is the symbol of the difficulty, and he thinks that populism was there in Eastern Europe, Central Europe before 1908, but never really was a major factor in the political outcomes and the ruling structures. But it could become that again. And here, I think that Hoffe's three-part transition can be revived as a challenge. And that's, in a way, what Roderick does without really even knowing this text of Hoffe. As far as I know, he doesn't know it or doesn't refer to it. And that's the globalization trilemma among democracy, nation state, hyperglobalization that resemble the other three, which we presented previously, namely liberal democracy, the coherent and strong national state, and the market economy, which by the standards of the 1990s was going to be in a globalized, a hyperglobalized setting. What Roderick suggests in all the essays where he touches this topic, and I will briefly outline this because you have not had a text which presents exactly this framework, is that the three are incompatible with one another. It sounds almost like Hoffe's hypothesis, but it is for everybody, not just the poor Central European, East European countries that Roderick argues this. The three will inevitably enter into conflict with one another. Democracy especially is going to be incompatible with hyperglobalization because democratic decision-making on a level of individual countries is going to be more and more in the golden straitjacket. Countries will be able to decide less and less. The fundamental decisions about social policy lay elsewhere in international competition, or to some extent in international bodies, or the strongest countries in some of the cases. It will be they and their challenge that will decide the outcomes. The Danes objected already to Maastricht in one referendum because they anticipated that even Europe would be a golden straitjacket for Danish democracy. So there's a conflict between these two dimensions, and the answer domestically will be to marginalize democracy. Post-democracy of Crouch is a term for this, except that Crouch has other causes for it, not only globalization. The other possible outcome here would be, however, dramatic attacks on globalization by those who are wedded to domestic democracy. And there will be similar conflicts between nation state and hyperglobalization, pretty obvious ones, and nation state and democracy too, because as a nation state makes itself strong in the context of international challenges, executive dominance, corporate interference in democratic process also will become more and more important. I can't talk about this whole theory. It's a chapter, a very long chapter of his book, The Globalization Paradox, a book that is to be highly recommended. And it is called the Trilemma, the Globalization Trilemma. I'm trying to look at the number of the chapter, which is chapter 9 of his book. All I can talk about is the solution. And the solution, as I put under one heading here, is to take two and reject one. Any two of these can be made compatible with one another if the challenge of the third is dramatically reduced. So authoritarian states are capable of remaining exactly what they are in the context of hyperglobalization. I mentioned the most obvious old example, the regime of Pinochet in Chile, but the current example of Erdogan would also indicate. I think other cases of populist governments would be more complicated to analyze in such a context, but certainly there are these pure examples. And it is here that right-wing populism is going to be located in Roderick's scheme. There is another option, which would be democratic international governance and hyperglobalization. Democracy need not suffer in a globalized context if we repeat it on a global level, right? Because on a national level, the capitalist economy is tamed by the democratic state, democratic capitalism as the term has it. But as decision-making gravitates outside and the fundamental challenges are international, then it is the international phenomena that have to be embedded in some way in democratic governance. Roderick has become more and more pessimistic about that outcome. In the book, he suggests Europe is the test case. The book was published in 2012. Brexit, obviously, is the key event which focused in his mind the problem. But in any case, Europe was initially considered by him to be an experiment that would test the possibility of international governance. If such a thing is possible, international governance taming the economy, that social Europe is the experiment that tries to demonstrate that on a somewhat smaller scale. But the scale is big enough that if it's possible in Europe, it is possible also internationally. If it's not possible in Europe, then it is not possible internationally. So Roderick moves from one view to the other in order to indicate that he has become more and more skeptical. The little thing you can Google immediately on Brexit presents the views of someone named Evans Pritchard, who argued, a left-wing person who argued for Brexit because the European polity is not democratic. And you need to save democracy from this technocratic entity that intervenes in democratic decision-making on a local level. If you're going to have democracy, you can have the nation state in the Roderick scheme, but you can't have global Europe. That's the shift in argumentation that is behind his increasing skepticism about international governance playing a role. So the choice becomes still two possibilities. Either then you pick hyperglobalization and the national state, or you pick the national state and democracy, but reject globalization, at least in its hyperglobalized form. Now, this is the place where I think, to give him benefit of a doubt, Roderick wished to locate left populism. Right? Right populism is in it's a triangle, this scheme. He puts globalization on top. I can't even draw my manuscript because this would require graphic abilities I don't have. But imagine a triangle. Globalization is on top. Democracy is on the left corner. The nation state is on the right. In the right corner, I'm not sure if he had it exactly in the same way. I guess you should put democracy on the left, nation state on the right, hyperglobalization on the top, neither left or right. If you join the national state and hyperglobalization, you get right-wing populism. If you join hyperglobalization with democracy, you would get democratic world governance, which is increasingly less possible as far as he is concerned. Europe as an ideal, not the reality, which is technocratic. And if you join the bottom two, namely democracy and the nation state, you, in the context of a weakened globalization, you get historically the Bretton Woods system, which allows for national variety. And at least in terms of the normative criteria of democratization, you get a democracy that is nationally oriented and not oriented to international regulation, and it's respectful of the democratic rights of self-determination of other countries. And this, of course, meant to Roderick opposition to democratic interventionism of various kinds. Now, the question I want to leave you with is it a good idea to put left populism into this box? Roderick, quite interestingly, if you look at his various essays, once in a while defines left populism as what you have in the northern part of Latin America. Elsewhere, he suggests that the answer to right populism is a populism that is democratic and pluralistic. This, I think, is the key contradiction that is behind the implication that you can put left populism in the Bretton Woods box, or consider it as a kind of revival of social democracy under the Bretton Woods system, which is, I think, what essentially he's suggesting here. Populism in all its varieties is perhaps democratic, that I think one can concede, but pluralistic certainly it is not. Its way of drawing the social field is in terms of friend-enemy relations. This is even true for the proto-populisms of the 19th century. And so in that case, democracy is endangered. Now, this is not inconsistent with the general framework of Roderick, because you could have then under the third field both a well-developed social democratic system like Denmark, with strong respect for political pluralism, and you could have weak democracies, relatively authoritarian or even relatively authoritarian or majoritarian democracies, which the populist regimes are. it is here that you would put populism. But the question I leave you with is a question of possibility. And it's an open question for us because having Denmark in that overall Bretton Woods scheme would mean that social democracy can be renewed in its classical form. And putting left-wing populism there means that you could have that solution in countries that do not have the advantages of the Andean republics, namely very, very large resources in raw materials, which at least for a historical period, something like 10 years, could be used to sustain a left populist project. Our problem is that both these options have difficulties in contemporary settings. And that would mean, of course, that Roderick's impulse in the essay you read is not incorrect, that if it's an epoch of populism, it's increasingly an epoch of right-wing populism, which does not require either financial resources that the classical welfare state required, or rich resources in raw materials, as in the case of the Andean republics, in order to be able to appeal to large numbers of people. If this is the epoch of populism, then it is increasingly becoming the epoch of right-wing populism and not the left-wing variety. Okay, that's the end of my lecture. As you can see, the initial the plan for the lecture involved a separate treatment of the Central European cases, Poland and Hungary. I didn't get to that, but I think it is not going to be difficult to fit Poland and Hungary into this scheme. Certainly, national populism has outcompeted left-wing populisms in those two countries more dramatically and radically than elsewhere. We can certainly see that right-wing populism has a lot of historical reasons, how it, on the basis of which it can build a coherent narrative and a coherent appeal. And of course, the fact, and most importantly, that the party that was to represent social democracy has engaged in an even more dramatic bait and switch in Central Europe than the North European, West European social democratic parties. And not only was it initially, historically, a social democratic party at one point, both in terms of its long distant origins and in terms of its brief history after 1989, but it was also a communist party, which was, in theory, much more redistributionist than the socialist parties are. For this party to become then a party that represents neoliberal stabilization, both in the short term and restructuration in the long term, represents a dramatic transformation, which for those to whom either of these versions of the left would appeal to, had to represent a great disappointment. The fact that the communists were also the authoritarian party of the old regime, Slavoj Žižek points this out, they are the capitalists as well as the communists at the same time. This, of course, creates an even greater narrative option opening for those who obviously were their opponents already in the late 1980s. Okay, I stop at this point, and the floor is open to you.
Thank you, first of all. It was extremely comprehensive and very illuminating. I have 3 points in response to it. One is a minor point about the concept of post-democracy. It seems to me that post-democracy is, in a way, forms a dyad with populism because they're mutually inverse, right? The post-democracy is democratic forms without content, and populism, at least if we follow Laclau, has democratic content, but hostile entirely to forms and institutional arrangements of what we understand to be liberal democracy. And my other 2 points concern this question of the left and the right. And I'm wondering, it seems to me, as you've laid it out, globalization and post-democracy capture both welfare deficits and representation deficits. But why left populism is not as successful, it seems to me, is that globalization and post-democracy have symbolic deficits that are more suitable to the right-wing discourse of nationalism. I think that's basically the argument that you've laid it out. And that's probably because of the cultural, one is the immigration into advanced capitalist countries, and the other one probably in the global south countries is the culture of cosmopolitanism and liberal elitism, one can say, at least that's the case in India. And it seems to me that there is a possibility of a left populism if we follow someone like Wolfgang Streeck. But the question is, and it's an addendum to the question you're asking, I think, is whether or not a left populism can be also nationalist. So can there be a left populism which is for redistribution, which is for managing welfare deficits, but is at the same time anti-migrant and hostile to, or wants to assert national identity?
Three questions are really excellent, though, and I have to answer them. The first is that populism and post-democracy are related also in that way that when populists come to democratic power, they themselves adopt post-democratic forms. And this is in line with the delegative democracy concept, which I already applied to them previously. They object to delegative democracy, but their own democracy is delegative in the sense that they want democracy to be delegated to a different leader, to a different person than to whom it's delegated through the ordinary processes of the existing processes of liberal democracy. This, of course, means that populism cannot do away with the problem that brings it into being on this level. It's also true on the economic level, by the way, for economic populism. And this means that there will be challenges from below, just holding the populist to their own message and their own claims, which of course would mean that tendentially it becomes more and more repressive. Venezuela is a good case of this, is that there was always some repression under Chavez, but he was more a relatively tolerant person compared to what goes on now. And you can see why, because the challenge from below has intensified. And Morales had to face that too, more attractive than Chavez, but he had to face it too. So populist governments become more repressive precisely because of their own violation of precisely, or their ambiguous relationship to both delegative and to post-democracy. So that's your first question. It's not easy to answer your questions, but let me be a little briefer for the other two. As far as the origins, you kind of support the argument of Roderick that the cultural discourse is stronger in lots of countries. And I have no reason to disagree with that. But it becomes stronger in the context of pessimism, whether social democracy or left populism are in good position to address the needs of the economic deficits, which would be the basis of their appeal. And that skepticism is in part because of globalization, in part because of historical baits and switch. I think in India too, if you look at Congress now, you're the expert, not me, but the history of Congress with respect to welfare state issues probably indicates a shift of the same type, not as radical as for the communist parties in Central Europe, but certainly I'm not really sure if it's I think Rajiv Gandhi who was criticized often for adopting neoliberal adjustment policies under international pressures, but still he adopted them. So once the skepticism develops, the option for the right axis becomes more salient, or the opening for the right axis. And everybody does it. It's not that there's no symbolic politics to begin with, of course. These axes are relevant to all liberal democracies. We know that, right, in the United States, where a lot of the discourse is about symbolic issues. And then your final point is that economic populism would still be possible in some settings. I'm not sure what your argument was, but without really now rehashing that, I would say that social democracy should be still possible. And this, of course, means that, in a way, left populism in some settings will be possible too. But I think we'd have to reinvent it. I think you can see that in Crouch's discussion, there's a lot of effort. And some of the texts of Roderick point in that direction too, because Roderick would say, we can reinvent it if we modify hyperglobalization. Let's again have capital controls, for example. Let's again, and this was an issue I left out, industrial policy. Hyperglobalization no longer allows industrial policies to be undertaken by countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan. The secret of the tigers is that they were able to subsidize fledgling industries for significant periods of time. Hyperglobalization bans that. The Chinese still violate that. One of the objections against China is always that they cheat. They're members of the WTO, but they subsidize. Well, Roderick is on their side and would suggest that we should be able to allow for room for that. Not for eternity, but for significant time periods. For certain industries, it should be permissible to give them the kind of support that requires them. This is the Gerschenkran thesis. In order to compete internationally, you need time, because you would always lose against those who are already there if you are not given time. It's a significant point I left out from my discussion, but Roderick has it in his book, that hyperglobalization eliminates not just unionization, but also the possibility of governmental industrial policy. Okay, I don't know if Javier or Adam was first, because I didn't see which hand appeared first on the on the screen. But okay, Javier, you implied that it's you, so go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make a comment on what Udipta asked about if it's possible to have like a left-wing populism that is also nationalist. I would say that it is, because at least in a lot of countries of the global south, at least in my case in Mexico, there is a strong component on protectionism of like the country's natural resources in a very nationalist way, like in a very old school classical populist 70s way. So I do believe that there is the possibility of left-wing populism to appear in countries of the global south with a certain degree of nationalism. But I don't think that it translates to anti-immigration sentiments, because most of the countries in the global south do not face the migration waves that countries in the global north do, which is why anti-immigration sentiments or xenophobia are more of a part of right-wing populism, because I don't think that there's any places where left-wing populism thrives, which focuses on economic inequality, that also faces a large demographic change because of immigration. So I think that is why we don't see it. But I think that it is a structural issue more than an ideological one, in terms of how the countries are, how do you say this? Yeah, like it's just a structure issue.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, of course, although in the period of the Venezuelan crisis, there was a certain issue in Colombia about Venezuelan immigrants. So occasionally this arises, and Mexico certainly faces an immigration issue. as a transit country, although I would suspect that some people would probably prefer staying in Mexico for cultural reasons, but it was not a problem for that reason. In Mexico was a problem because people used it as a transit to the United States, opening up the country to American pressures and counteractions. And in that sense, immigration could not be. It led eventually to collaboration between López Obrador and Trump governments, but it was because of American pressure, not the immigration pressure itself. Not, that there isn't some pressure for those parts of Mexico where the immigrants are actually coming through. It's a different matter for Mexico City, and it's a different matter for Juarez, I would say. So there is an issue, but it's not a major issue. And of course, culturally, it's not an issue at all because you're all Spanish speakers, you're all Catholic, more or less, although there are evangelicals. But evangelicalism has been accepted on a popular level in Latin America, even the bishops don't like it necessarily, but on a popular level, it does not create too much tension. So on a cultural level, there is no European type problem. And let's face it, it's an objective problem. I'm very pro-immigrant in every possible way, but I think with Crouch, I would say there is a question of numbers and it's a question of culture. And that has to be faced. In Mexico, it's the numbers. It's not the culture that, to some extent, has been a problem. So I would agree with you that the main reason for the main fuel for right-wing populism is not present. Although Fujimori showed that as long as there is exclusion and a political, cultural separation of different, I don't know what to call them, different segments of the population, namely white, mestizo, and indigenous, and black too, mulatto, because in some countries that is an issue as well. As long as that existed, there is a possibility of such an appeal. It's not immigration as much as this. But interestingly, even Fujimori's populism was mobilizing the excluded and not mobilizing against them. It's interesting why that should be the case. I don't really know the historical cultural reasons, because certainly countries like Brazil, there is certainly a racial divide, or at least a racial differentiation. But the idea of mobilizing the Brazilian populace to the president does not, well, he might, because he has a demagogue against criminals. And so he has used what is, of course, assumed to be a phenomenon of Black and mulatto populations, if I can use those terms. I don't know, they're not politically correct anymore. Nothing is. But in any case, that possibly in Brazilian populism has played a role. I think that the military regime in Brazil was particularly vicious in the favelas. And he himself appeals to that background in some way. So it could be present in Brazilian populism, that right-wing. But otherwise, no. Otherwise, in Latin America, the left-wing motives remain potentially the more powerful ones. But it's still a problem of actually what kind of political shape to give that, because the resource-based approach ran into difficulties. And of course, it would have been better had President Chavez followed the Norwegian method for dealing with the resource. And that would have meant he would have been less radical in redistribution, but more long-term oriented in terms of what would be beneficial for the population. Because even with redistribution, you have the problem of short and long term. You have to think about the welfare of the population in the longer term, and not just your immediate political advantage, which is always short term. Okay, Adam, you have your hand up.
I have two questions. The first is just clarification. The second is more substantive. For the first, when we think about hyperglobalization in terms of markets, I'm a bit confused of how to think about this. Does hyperglobalization and responses to globalization both include large-scale organizations like the WTO, like you discussed, as well as isolationist policies and high tariffs, or does it only include the former? The second question concerns your response to Udipta's first comment. You said that there will be challenges from below on holding populists to their own methods. And I was curious about how to think about that in terms of the supply and demand side model. Do those narratives give a already established and already present model through which to articulate demands because the populist has already campaigned on them? Or does the populist's ambiguous relationship to democracy mean that none of those narratives quite fit them? Are they very easy to talk about because they've already laid out what they can be judged on? Or are they very difficult to talk about because they don't fit into the usual way about democracy?
Well, in terms of your second question, I think a Peruvian or someone from, which would be another country where this, from Ecuador, an Ecuadorian, a Peruvian, countries where there have been many populist leaderships could give you a good answer. Because I'm not personally able to tell whether the discourse remains the same and just gravitates from one challenger to another, or it is altered. Certainly, the economic context, sometimes immigration context, makes a difference. And so the discourse will have different elements. Also, the fact that the ability to satisfy the demands you once addressed is no longer available, either because of resources or because of international changes. Remember, the import substitution models were economically very successful for a certain period. And that, of course, means that the discourse for that period could remain the same. But then with the crisis of those models, Argentina has the most dramatic one, the crisis of that model, can you really return to that initial discourse? Can Menem be a Peronist quite the same way as Juan Perón and Evita Perón were? And so given contextual changes, the discourse changes. And of course, that means that movements from below, that's your question, that challenge the populist government for not satisfying or not fulfilling its demands, not fulfilling its promises, may indeed revive the same language or shift to another. But this would have to be studied case by case. There's also the question of the movement of languages from country to country in Latin America, because the linguistic similarity, the fact that people become exiles. For example, Mexico is the place where everybody becomes an exile from previous military regimes, or possibly from populist ones too. So a movement, a shift, this is something that has to be studied empirically. I don't really know the answer. Now, your first question was what, Adam? Remind me.
It was a clarification of how to think about globalization in terms of markets. And I was confused as to whether we should be thinking about it in terms of isolationism, in terms of high tariffs, or if it is just the World Trade Organization's large meetings, et cetera.
Well, globalization, obviously, if you want to write a book about this, I know people who would have a lot of aspects, right? A globalization of communications, internet, look, we're in it now, right? I have somebody here is in Hungary, somebody here is in Poland, Joanna is in Poland, Barbara is in Budapest, Udipta is in Delhi. I don't know where everybody else is. So we are already in a globalized communication world, even just being here. And that's part of globalization. And there are other forms which have to do with ideas, which has to do with travel, movement of peoples, just much more traveling before COVID, of course, much more traveling than any time in history. I mean, people really, the enormous numbers of tourists you see from Asia in Italy and so on. I mean, it's this kind of movement of peoples is new, not just immigration, which is also on a fairly new level, I would suspect, although they're probably numbers because there were huge waves of immigration early in the 20th century, late 19th century as well. So globalization is all these things. And the argument here, we're not Marxist economists, and Roderick isn't, but in any case, Marx was surely right that the economy is one of the important dimensions which conditions all else in contemporary societies. I mean, who can deny that fundamental insight of Marx? Not that he got it right in terms of where things were going and what even the reorganization should look like or could look like. He got a lot of things wrong, but the basic premise is right. Now, not that the economy determines everything in the last instance. That may be wrong, but that it determines things often is correct. And so we have to take it into account. And so in that sense, I follow Roderick in that initially Marxist impulse and take that dimension of the economy that influences the phenomena that we're dealing with. Populism is above all a discourse and an ideology and a political strategy. It's not an economics, although there is populist economics in some settings, which no longer is even that much alive in most places, but there is but mostly populism. What ties populism together is the political discursive, ideational, even strategic dimensions. And now, if you turn to the economy, we want to use the economy in partially explaining how that is possible. What gives rise to demands? What gives rise to structural strains? And what gives rise to possible narratives? And that's where trade comes in, because that is the thing, or globalization on a level of trade and globalization of capital, of finance, because they are the ones that can be most immediately linked to our issues here. And we link them through several variables, intermediary variables, if you want methodology, right? Several intermediary variables, one being inequality, one being labor rights, one being industrial policies, and then the cultural, which Roderick, who's an economist, nevertheless suggests that in some respects comes from the economic as an intermediary variable. We object to immigration because we're squeezed by globalization, not the immigrants themselves necessarily, but they're the ones we can do something about. We can project the blame to them, or project the solutions also onto policies which deal with them. So it's a question of the big structural role of the economy, which is not all decisive here, but it is important, right? So, don't take my argument using Roderick to be a proto-Marxist one about the last instance or anything like that, but it's important, cannot be possibly denied. And then come the intermediate variables, of which there are, I'm using Roderick's language in the second essay, of which there are also supply and demand oriented variables. I'm not following his language exactly. And there are economic and cultural components, both on a level of supply and demand. Because there's cultural strain, that's the demand. There are cultural narratives, that's the supply. There are economic strains on a level of demand, and economically oriented narratives on a level of the supply. It's a very full answer to your question, but I think, it's important.
I don't know. Sorry, I don't know if you already answered this question, but about this view that Roderick has on the left populism. Actually, it seems that you mentioned that he prioritized in this way the democratic element, but also the and not the market economy one, but also this national state modernization, I think. But the problem is that what happens also, I don't know if this is from my perspective, I don't know if it works in that way, but there is not such in the left populist experiences as in the cases of Bolivia, Ecuador, or Venezuela. There is no such thing as an intelligent liberalization or intelligent globalization. Actually, because of this issue of the raw materials, they only engage in the supply chain, in the global supply chain, in a way that they also they don't neither support the construction of a good state in terms of welfare, and this is more clear in the case of Venezuela. They destruct the institutions. Chavez begins with fair social policies, but then he precarized the economic life in such a way that the whole citizenship from Venezuela moved to other countries. So I don't know if it is really a good example of an intelligent way to establishing a good left populist regime in that way. So I don't know what is your opinion about that issue. I think that it's very. I don't know if Danny Roderick, but I think that it's very, very.
What Cesar is objecting to is the argument that right-wing populism is cultural, and left-wing populism is in terms of its critique, an economic critique, and specifically a critique of globalization. And what you bring up is extremely interesting. I don't know if if Roderick has thought of it. He probably has, because he writes on these topics. I haven't noticed him noticing this particular problem, that countries like Venezuela at the height of Chavez are completely export-oriented countries. And whether imports have become more or less expensive does not seem to be a major issue. And in that sense, the trade inequality of trade, of course, touches Venezuela, because Venezuelans in that context gain, but let's say somebody in Paraguay might very well lose, right? Because as you free trade for the whole OAS region, right, this exporting country, Venezuela, is gaining. The whole country gains. And so objection to import. Now, it may be a little bit different, though, with the other issue of capital liberalization, right? Because wouldn't capital liberalization imply that anybody who wants to invest in Venezuelan oil can invest? So buying up Venezuelan oil would be a possibility on the basis of capital liberalization. But it is not possible to Chavez, right? In fact, if anything, they are expropriating the foreign owners, which of course is against the logic of globalization on the level of capital liberalization, right? So you are completely right on a level of trade, and to his credit, I think Roderick often has to say, populists are not usually against trade. And there's good reason for it for a lot of countries, because trade lowers prices. That's not the reason in Venezuela. The country is export dependent in the period and remains that even now, right, with the sanctions and whatever else they have to face. But in any case, even if trade is not an antagonist, nevertheless, globalization is a problem. And in that sense, it wouldn't be incorrect to say that the Venezuelan solution brings together the nation and a version of democracy, without, of course, rejecting globalization in all its dimensions. That's what your corrective supplies. Is that a good answer, Cesar? I'm so worried about when I talk about countries I know so little about, only from newspapers.
That's okay. But what I'm saying is that even though if they are very concerned about not increasing the degree of globalization, of the impact of globalization in this country, they actually participate of this of this, and they do that because I know this is a cliche, but every time that Chavez said something against Bush, I remember, he still maintains selling oil to the United States.
That was my point. That was my point. That was my point.
I mean, it's not. It's more a rhetorical issue, common on the tradition of the anti-imperialist tradition of the political rhetorics in Latin America, but at the same time, it deprecates the construction of a strong state or a modern state in a way that it is useful or.
No, we agree on this point. We agree on this point, but what about my second point, that as far as capital liberalization, Chavez, Morales, Correa, I don't know about López Obrador. Actually, it would be an interesting question for Mexico now, right? But at least those three are trying to protect. In the case of protect local ownership, local capital, the state from international penetration.
Yeah, no, and also they were thinking about with all these countries of the Latin American Alliance, the Bolivarian Alliance, the countries of the ALBA. They think about different ways of economic organization in the region. So right. That's the reason why they use this other.
Well, that's another important thing.
Way of doing this kind of globalization.
That's another interesting question for Latin America, right? Because Europe, such as it is, and technocratic critics are right, nevertheless, it has a lot of internal redistribution, right? And, the question in Latin America, where there's tremendous inequality. I mentioned Paraguay before because I think it is the poorest country in terms of pro capita production. But there are differences all along. And then, of course, regions of individual countries. And that's the issue of the indigenous, that our regions have been clearly discriminated against in terms of inputs and redistribution. But for Latin America, and this would be the Crouch solution, not so much the Roderick one, for Latin America, a kind of regionalization in which the possibility of redistribution would be extended from individual countries to the region as a whole would be an important safeguard precisely against what even the individual populist regime wants to fight. If it's U.S. penetration, if it's U.S. intervention, if it's U.S. capital, then the Latin American countries together are much more powerful than any one of them separately. Obviously, Mexico is a very large country and is able to defend itself better. But still, I wonder who had the stronger cards in the renegotiation of NAFTA. So in that sense, NAFTA could be understood from even the Mexican point of view as of course important. It gives us markets, but at the same time it creates dangers too. Anyway, so I think we're on the same wavelength on both issues, Cesar. Udipta raised the question of culture, and I didn't mean now to go from a political determinism to an economic one, right? That I tend to think that these domains of social life are all important and under some conditions can become primary. And there are people who think that the populist phenomena can be best explained on the cultural level. This is, I think, the second question of Udipta reflected a little of that interest. And of course, when it comes to culture, the media play a greater role than anywhere else, because culture is not even alive unless it's disseminated. Economy is alive as long as you buy and sell things. You buy a bottle of milk, and the economy was present for you, even though you did not study micro or macroeconomics ever, right? So the economy you're in. Culture, you could be isolated from in such a way, at the time of COVID, if we didn't have internet, we'd be pretty isolated on the cultural level. So in that sense, culture requires the media. And I want to deal with those topics together. There are people, must be internet addicts, who think that the whole problem of contemporary populism is caused by the new media. Empirically, of course, we're not going to sustain that, given the fact that the radio and television played a significant role. At the end of the 19th century, it was printed media that helped mobilize the Narodniki and the American populists. So it's not that populism was impossible without the new media, but it is a reasonable thesis that new media changes the phenomenon, changes it, allows it to become more segmented. At any given time, historically, would have been more difficult to find right and left populisms together. In Italy, you can find sometimes 3 or 4 different ones. Would that be possible without the new media? So there is certainly a difference that the new media bring in. And of course, they bring in a lot of power for cultural discourse also. So we'll talk about those 2 topics together next time.